Al Sharpton spent his life fighting everything Strom Thurmond stood for. What genealogists discovered in 2007 was that the two men were connected by something neither of them chose: a single enslaved man in Edgefield, South Carolina, a legal document that listed him as property, and a surname that traveled from a slave owner's estate directly into one of the most recognizable names in American civil rights history. This is the true ancestry of Al Sharpton. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. He did not go looking for this. Al Sharpton had spent decades in public life, on street corners and in courtrooms, at pulpits and on television, in the middle of every major racial confrontation the country had produced for 30 years. He knew American history. He had lived large portions of it, but his own family history, the specific details of where his name came from and what it had passed through to reach him, was not something he had ever tried to examine. He knew his grandfather had run a grocery store in Florida. That was roughly where the knowable past ended. In 2007, a reporter from the New York Daily News approached him with a proposition. The paper had been working with genealogists from Ancestry.com on a separate project and was now asking prominent figures if they wanted to have their family histories traced. Sharpton agreed without hesitation. He was curious, he said later, about what his background might contain. He thought he knew what kind of story was likely to surface. He suspected his ancestors had been enslaved. Most African-American families with roots in the South carried that history somewhere behind the wall. The records could not get past. What he did not suspect was what the name Sharpton itself would turn out to mean. The genealogist spent 3 weeks working through the documents: census records, death certificates, marriage records, estate files, and land transfers. They were not looking for anything specific. They were following the paper wherever it went. And the paper went south. It went to South Carolina. It went to a county that history had passed through more than once and left its marks on in ways that were still, in 2007, entirely present. Edgefield County sits in the western corner of South Carolina near the Georgia border. It is a place where the land held its records longer than most, and somewhere inside those records the name Sharpton was waiting, attached not to an ancestor who had carried it across an ocean, but to the man who had owned the people who eventually bore it. Edgefield County is not a place that appears often in the standard telling of American history. It appears constantly in the specific history of American power. By the time of the Civil War, Edgefield had produced more governors and United States senators than almost any other county in South Carolina. It was plantation country in the fullest sense, not just economically, but politically, socially, and architecturally. The wealth that built its courthouses, its churches, and its family estates came from the labor of enslaved people. The men who controlled that labor translated it into political influence with a consistency that lasted well past emancipation. The county's records survived with unusual completeness precisely because the people who kept them had reason to keep them carefully. Land, property, and the legal instruments that transferred both from one generation to the next were the foundation of everything that Edgefield's ruling families had built. Those records were preserved because they documented wealth. That they also documented human beings as components of that wealth was not considered a complication worth noting at the time. The genealogist found the name Sharpton attached to a man named Alexander Sharpton. He was a white landowner and slaveholder in Edgefield County, prosperous enough to appear in the records with regularity and significant enough to have a road in the area bear his family's name into the present day. The name Sharpton did not belong to Al Sharpton's African ancestors. It belonged to the man who owned them. When emancipation came and formerly enslaved people were required by circumstance to take surnames, they took the names of the families they had been attached to, because those were the only names the system had ever assigned them, the only names anyone around them would have recognized, the only names that connected them to the people and the places that made up whatever was left of their lives. Coleman Sharpton took the name of the man who had owned him. His descendants carried it forward, and somewhere inside Alexander Sharpton's family, a thread was running that the genealogists had not yet reached. They were about to. The document exists. It is not a summary or a reconstruction. It is a legal instrument, filed in Edgefield County, executed in 1860, and it reads the way such documents read, with the flat commercial precision of a transaction between parties who considered the matter entirely routine. Alexander Sharpton's son, Jefferson, had died in debt. Under the terms of the estate settlement, Jefferson's enslaved people were to be transferred to his creditors and his children as a means of satisfying what was owed. The document lists them by first name, age, and sex. It names Coleman, 25 years old. It names Biddy, female, 22 years old. It names Harrison, approximately 4 years old, and Botchus, approximately 8 years old. It notes in the language standard to such instruments the future increase of the female slave, meaning any children Biddy might bear would also be transferred as property under the same terms. Coleman and Biddy were almost certainly husband and wife. Harrison and Bacchus were almost certainly their sons. The document does not use those words. It does not acknowledge the family as a family. It processes them as it would process livestock or furniture, because under the law that produced it, the distinction did not exist. They were transferred to the custody of Julia Thurmond, Jefferson Sharpton's widow, who would take them to Liberty, Florida, where their labor would be used to work off the remaining debts of Jefferson's estate. The arrangement was temporary in its legal framing. For Coleman and his family, the practical reality was that they had been given away to settle a dead man's accounts and sent to a place none of them had chosen. What the document cannot tell us is what Coleman understood about what was happening. It cannot tell us what Biddy said to her sons that night or what Harrison and Bacchus were told about where they were going. The record preserves the transaction. It has nothing to say about the people inside it. What it does preserve, in the name of the woman who received them, is the thread that the genealogists had been following all along. Julia Thurmond was a widow in Edgefield County, South Carolina, in 1860. Her husband, Jefferson Sharpton, had died broke. His debts had passed to his estate, and his estate had passed Coleman and his family to her custody. She was not a prominent figure. She left no particular mark on the historical record beyond what the documents required her to leave. But the genealogists were not following Julia Thurmond because of who she was. They were following her because of who her family was. Her grandfather was the great-great-grandfather of Strom Thurmond. The connection runs through documented genealogical lines, land records, census entries, marriage certificates, the ordinary paperwork of family and property that Edgefield County had preserved with its characteristic thoroughness. It is not speculative. It is not a matter of circumstantial resemblance or regional coincidence. The genealogists at Ancestry.com spent 3 weeks establishing it across multiple independent document types before they were prepared to present it as a finding. The lead researcher on the project, Megan Smoleniak, the chief family historian for Ancestry.com at the time, described the connection as something she had not anticipated. She said she knew they would find something. She had not expected this. Strom Thurmond had died 4 years earlier, in 2003, at the age of 100. He had served in the United States Senate for 47 years, longer than almost any senator in the country's history. He had run for president in 1948 on a platform dedicated to preserving racial segregation. He had filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for more than 24 hours, setting a record that still stands. He had spent decades as the most visible and most determined political opponent of the legal equality that Al Sharpton had devoted his public life to advancing. The genealogists now had documents establishing that Al Sharpton's great-grandfather had been transferred as property to a member of Strom Thurmond's extended family. They arranged to present the findings to Sharpton in person. He sat in his Manhattan radio studio. They walked him through what the records showed. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said it out loud. Strom Thurmond's family owned my family. Sharpton called it the most shocking thing in his life, not the most shocking thing he had learned about history, the most shocking thing in his life. The distinction matters. He had spent 30 years in the middle of American racial conflict. He had been stabbed during a protest march. He had run for president. He had stood at more funerals for black men killed by the state than most people would ever attend. The scale of what he had witnessed and absorbed and argued against publicly was not small. And he was saying that this, a genealogist in his radio studio walking him through a chain of documents, was the most shocking thing any of it had produced. The reason it landed the way it did is not difficult to understand once you sit with it. Sharpton had known in the abstract that his ancestors were likely enslaved. Most African Americans with Southern roots carry that knowledge somewhere in their understanding of their own family. It is a general truth, shared, almost statistical in the way it distributes across generations. What the genealogists had done was collapse the distance between the general and the specific. They had given it names. They had given it a county. They had given it a document with precise ages and a woman's name and a dollar figure attached to the transaction. And then they had attached that woman's name to a man whose face Sharpton knew, whose voice he had heard, whose political career had been dedicated to ensuring that the descendants of people like Coleman would remain beneath the people who had owned them. Strom Thurmond had not been an abstraction to Sharpton. He had met him once in 1991 while traveling with James Brown, who knew the senator. The meeting was brief. Sharpton described it afterward as awkward. He had not been glad to meet Thurmond. He had shaken the man's hand because the circumstances required it, and he had moved on. He had no way of knowing at the time what the circumstances actually were, what the paper trail had been carrying toward that handshake for more than a century before either of them was born. Strom Thurmond is not a figure who requires much introduction for anyone who lived through the second half of the 20th century, but what he represents in the context of this story is worth stating precisely because the precision is what gives the connection its weight. He ran for president in 1948 as the candidate of the states' rights Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, on a platform whose central commitment was the preservation of racial segregation. He did not soften that position in the campaign. He stated it directly. He promised that the laws of the southern states separating black Americans from white Americans would be defended against federal interference. He received 39 electoral votes. He carried 4 states. He lost. He returned to South Carolina and continued. In 1957, when the United States Senate took up a civil rights bill that would have provided federal protection for the voting rights of black Americans, Thurmond took the Senate floor and spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes without stopping, the longest filibuster in Senate history, a record that still stands. He spoke against the bill. The bill passed anyway. Thurmond continued. He served in the Senate until 2003. He died in office at the age of 100. What emerged 6 months after his death reframed everything that had come before it. A 78-year-old woman named Essie Mae Washington Williams came forward and announced that she was Strom Thurmond's daughter. Her mother, Carrie Butler, had been 16 years old, a black girl working as a maid in the Thurmond family home. When Thurmond, then 22, fathered a child with her, Thurmond had known about his daughter for decades. He had quietly paid for her education. He had never acknowledged her publicly. The family confirmed the account after Washington Williams came forward. Her name was added to the monument honoring Thurmond outside the South Carolina State House. The man who had built a political career on the premise that black and white Americans should remain separate had a black daughter he kept hidden for nearly 8 decades. And now 4 years after that revelation, the genealogists had found something else. Coleman Sharpton did not disappear from the record after emancipation. That is worth noting because for many formerly enslaved people, freedom marked the point at which the documents stopped. The machinery of slavery had generated paper because it had commercial interest to protect. The machinery of freedom generated far less. and what it did generate was uneven, incomplete, and often indifferent to the specific lives it was supposed to be recording. Coleman survived the gap. He appears again in Florida, in Liberty County, working as a turpentine dipper. It was one of the most physically punishing forms of labor available in the post-Civil War South. The work required cutting into living pine trees to extract the resin, working in heat, breathing fumes, handling a substance that bonded to skin and would not release without a solvent. Workers ended each day washing themselves with gasoline to remove what the turpentine had left behind. The job was legal. It was paid, in the technical sense. It was one of the few options open to a black man in rural Florida in the years immediately following emancipation, and it was brutal in ways that the word free does not adequately account for. His son, Coleman Jr., built something different. He owned a grocery store in Liberty County. He was also a preacher. Sharpton did not know either of these things before the genealogist told him. He had known his grandfather existed. He had not known what his grandfather had made of the circumstances he inherited. The distance between Coleman, the turpentine dipper, and Coleman Jr., the grocer and preacher, is one generation. One lifetime spent in punishing labor, a child raised inside that labor, a store built from what came after it. That compression is not unusual in African American family history. It is one of the patterns that repeats across the documentary record of the post-emancipation South, the specific, grinding distance between formal freedom and anything that resembled its substance. Sharpton stood at the end of that line, 4 generations from Coleman, one of the most recognized voices in American public life, still carrying the name of the man who had owned his great-grandfather as property. What he chose to do with that name is where the story arrives. Sharpton did not change his name after the discovery. He has not changed it since. That decision is not a small one. The name Sharpton came to Coleman through the specific mechanism of ownership, assigned not chosen, inherited, not earned, attached to an African man and his family by the legal and commercial apparatus of American slavery. It carries within it the entire history the genealogist had just spent 3 weeks excavating. Every document in that chain, the estate transfer, the debt settlement, and the transaction that sent Coleman and Biddy and their children to Liberty, Florida, exists because the name Sharpton belonged first to Alexander Sharpton, the white landowner in Edgefield County, and was transferred along with the people he owned. Sharpton kept it anyway, and the reason he has given is precise. He wrote in a 2007 op-ed that every time he writes his name from that point forward, he will think about how he got it, not with shame, not with the impulse to replace it with something that carries less history, with the full weight of what it means to have arrived at that name through the specific path that produced it. There is something in that choice that connects directly back to the opening of this story. Sharpton spent his life fighting everything Thurmond stood for. The political project Thurmond dedicated his career to, the legal subordination of Black Americans, the preservation of a racial order built on exactly the kind of ownership that produced Coleman's name, is what Sharpton's public life was organized against. And the name he carried into every one of those fights, the name on every march and every lawsuit and every news conference and every campaign, was the name of the family that owned the man he descended from. The genealogists had set out to trace a family history. What they had actually reconstructed was a compressed map of American racial history. 2 men on opposite sides of it, bound together by a document filed in a county courthouse in 1860, and a family name that slavery had assigned and history had refused to let go. The name was given by ownership. What was built under it was something else entirely. Coleman Sharpton was listed as property in 1860. His great-grandson became one of the most visible civil rights figures in American history. The connection to Strom Thurmond's family was not metaphor, it was documentation. The same county records that recorded Coleman's transfer recorded the family that received him. What those records cannot reach is what came before Edgefield, where Coleman's people originated. Which part of Africa produced the man whose name was erased and replaced before any of this history began? That answer was never written down. It may never be found.